biannual in order to join our school. The parents have to study in our school for parents. That's the condition. 2 modules last for 2 months, 2 days plus 2 days. Parents come to us and they figure out whether they share our ideology, philosophy, values, to what extent they are comfortable and trusting. Can they relax? Because that's what kids recognize as the biggest outcome of parents attending the parent school, that they get relaxed. Please sit closer. We'll be using whiteboard. We'll be putting down some statements there, your answers. On the one hand, obviously, we have the script of this presentation, but on the other hand, it's important for us to be able to answer all of your questions, so don't be embarrassed to break us off. We might respond, we'll give the answer later, so bear with us. You might raise questions during the presentation. We'll figure it out as we go along. Questions is our favorite question tool. Oscar Ferrambier was brought by us each year for a couple of years from France to learn how to ask questions that promote the thinking process. So, your answers. Who is a responsible child? The ideal case scenario. He packs his bags, school bags. Okay. What does it mean? Is the master of his word. Beautiful. What does you mean safe? Are you serious or are you joking? Is not cocky, washes dishes. Is no longer a slave to the parents. Liberated from slavery. What are the symptoms? How would we recognize that? Please share more of your comments. What else? And then he never cries. Cool. Delivers and never cries afterwards. Can you illustrate it with an example? So, de facto, you have a responsible child, you have no problem with the responsibility, but we are curious about examples of those who feel that their kids are irresponsible. Who is irresponsible, is not ready to accept the consequences of actions. What do you mean by accept? Like, yes, I failed. They are responsible for the consequences of their choices. How can a kid be responsible? Can you illustrate it with the concrete examples? I agree with that. And where's the responsibility here? Okay, he is not putting on warm clothes. He will get sick. And fine, that's life. Oh, and then he cures himself and earns for the money for medicines. You outline how this responsibility should come into existence, and he doesn't yet put on a hat. What else? That's an irresponsible child. Promised, failed to deliver. Promised, failed to deliver. What else? A child who suffers when he did something wrong. A child should behave as a beaten dog if he did something wrong. How else would we recognize that he suffers, that he failed to do something? So if he suffers and he failed to deliver, then he is labeled irresponsible. Okay, what else? We'll figure it out. That's not the answer to the question we're trying to collect examples for. So what we're trying to drive you at is to recognize that we all expect something from our kids, right? And if your child meets those expectations, we label him responsible. If not, then irresponsible. So right now we're trying to come up as bullets with all those expectations. In other words, we recognize that a child is but the topic of responsibility, lack of responsibility of a child, that's the parent's problem, not child's. Let's review this question. What did we expect from a child whom we label irresponsible? That's our internal thought. Cries, what's an irresponsible child? So give us examples when you feel or think that. Disorder in the room. Look, when we discuss it philosophically, then we can cool examples, but when we start interacting with the child, we forget about it. So disorder, you said, right? Homework. Yeah, let's stay honest here. True, homework. And look at those examples. What connection does it have to all those highbrow philosophical statements that you started this session with? That's your opinion. Not caring. So he is not doing homework, and that means he is uncaring? So where is the responsibility in this picture? Or irresponsibility for that matter? So disorder, homework, not following the prescribed daily routine. But how do you instill this routine? You agree with kids and then you trust that they will follow it? Okay. How does it happen when you exercise trust? Through what? Conversation? Talking to them? How do we usually come to agreements? Concrete examples, case studies, please. There's a kernel in truth in there, but we'll talk about this a bit later. Thank you. Look, a child says, I want a puppy. What next? That is to say, we set the conditions which the child have to follow so that the puppy will appear. Which conditions? And usually it's the kids who are supposed to take care of a puppy. But if a kid is only 10 years of age and he answers, well, I want a puppy, but I don't want to take care of it, is it possible? By raise of hands. And he would still bring a puppy to your house? Step by step, please. So, we started by saying that we start by setting out the conditions, and can a kid who was told that only when he meets the conditions the puppy would be brought, is it possible that he would make this statement? Why? Because he wants to have a dog. But what does a child know about taking care of a dog? Well, first we need to identify all the underlying processes of responsibility versus irresponsible behavior.
А давай потом. Это просто, да, следующий этап будет, я думаю. Да.
A child can agree knowing in advance that he would fail to deliver on them. But why would you think something like that about your child? I'm just curious. Yeah, that's the first component. So what you think is this. When a child agrees to all of your conditions, he already analyzed the ways out of committing to deliver on what he promised, right? We're talking about a child who is 9 or 10 years of age. You know, our convictions often enough identify not only our actions but how we live our lives. And sometimes it's difficult to discuss it at the level of consequences when we start by assuming that a child consciously and deliberately lies to us. Well, that's a different story altogether. What if it's a dog that was hungry for a week or soils your carpet day in and day out? So it's easy with inanimated toys and things, but it's hardly applicable to a living creature like a dog, right? Thank you for this comment. It's not even about assisting, it's just doing it instead of a child. Even though it's not the topic that we raise, which is responsibility, but when we deal with the lies, we break down kids into teams, 12-year-old teenagers, and the question is, when and why children lie? And since they talk about themselves, not abstract kids, they share lots of reasons, and in top 3, one of the reasons is because our parents are lying themselves. And we ask them, when do your parents lie? Well, sometimes they omit important information that kids should know. Sometimes they promise that they will be back home at 8 p.m. They arrived at 8:30, and there might be a valid reason for this, but then the kids recognize it as a lie, and then kids lie also because that's the culture in this household when we promise one thing and deliver something different. Super, that's extremely important. You just described how you understanding what the responsibility is all about and in which way the child is ready to bear the responsibility, how you take this nature into consideration. But we suggest to find from everyone else what a kid can and cannot deliver. And when we come across cases of responsibility or lack of responsibility, responsible or irresponsible behavior, and differentiate from the constructs that have nothing to do with this major notion of responsibility. So, what makes us most angry when kids are not bearing responsibility? So, disorder in their room and not doing homework and not following the daily routines and not brushing teeth and not taking showers. Well, 10-year-old boys, come on. They hate showering. When the child fails to do what? Well, when a child just doing nothing and idling, that's about our yesterday's topic, laziness. On the one hand, it's a productive state for a short while, but if it takes too long, then it reflects on some other problems when he idles his life, not being able to satisfy some important needs and stays for a long time in the state of apathy because he doesn't deem necessary to deliver on your expectations, or it means that while in the process of satisfying his needs and when he needs to stay active, he just didn't hear your expectations. So it's not about responsibility at all. It's about some other things altogether. Regardless how long a child stays idle, it's still productive, unless this is a learned carelessness. That's one and the same thing. It's about other processes in a child that he has full right to behave. So we're back here to the slide. Tell us, please, why we want all this from them. Why do we need responsibility? To make the life easier? Yeah, we need to start putting it down, probably. To control what? To be aware, to control. Like yesterday at Dima Ziter's class, prepare for grown-up life. And all of those examples, they're about what? And what is this about? What sort of concern, fear, of what? Here it's quite simple, to make our lives simple. The fear for a child, well, an example, the child fails to take care of the dog, so the fear is that he would never take care of his grown-up parents. Oh, great, so we'll never bring a glass of water when we're old. Yeah? What else are we afraid of?
That he's going to become a bomb. Right, what else? What else do we fear? Let's not be that categorical. He's going to continue living with his parents. He will not be able to cope with the difficulties. A bad mother. So we will feel sorry ourselves. We will feel ashamed. Is he gonna carry your portrait with him everywhere he goes? did not fulfill my expectations.
Да, кстати, это сейчас есть термин для этого,
And there is a term for this.
проекция, да, наверное.
It's very interesting because this is the basis why we call him irresponsible and so on and so forth. Wait a second. I'm afraid we will not have time for everything, but this is an important story. Well, it's kind of the same. The fear of what?
Сейчас, подожди.
Wait,
Давайте еще раз фиксируем.
so let's
Здесь и сейчас
note this down.
я что-то им должен.
To make my life easier, I want them to take care of their issues themselves, giving you water when you will be old, living with you forever.
Еще другая.
Then there is another thing. People will judge me for that, for raising that, and then I'm projecting my unrealized wishes through him.
Самое главное, что это все реально не о ребенке.
Well, it's not about this child anymore, right? How do we respond?
А шантаж какого рода?
Hooray! What kind of blackmail?
Не сделаешь, будет вот так.
If you don't do this, you will not do that. So, what's your response? You get irritated and you punish.
Ну, запугиваем, что я больше не
Well, you keep threatening
наказание,
with certain punishment, or you will never ever.
новые запреты, а все
Well, we're giving him a chance. Well, you take away his notebook or something. Thank you. So Peter was asking whether he had an opportunity to say no, or he might say may not do this. My son is 21, and I remember when he was 16 and I was trying to make him wash dishes. I was obsessed with that, and we had a dialogue. We prescribed all the responsibilities around the house, and he chose washing dishes. He said, I don't like anything else, it's easier for me than other things, but it's not gonna work. That's what I can tell you. But why? It's not an agreement. Well, you're now going deeper. We just don't have time to finalize the topic, but I think that that's going to be a good way to finalize it. We have enough time. So why? This child, even when you distribute it and share the responsibilities, why he still does not do what he's supposed to do? Why it's not for him? Well, that was my problem. In fact, this is my house. And since this is my house, not yours, he probably won't take any responsibility. Well, indeed, this is my problem, and this is what I came up with. So I'm trying to negotiate. What else? Then we are discussing specifics, because we narrowed down to the core of the problem. And this is theory. Theory number one. Responsibility is not possible if you don't have adequate consequences for every case. Like yesterday, I was talking about motivation, and we mentioned this a little bit. When, let's say, there is a case and a consequence, or when there is an incident and I myself decide what kind of consequences will be. Oftentimes we offer or we suggest some nonsense. You know, you do this and then you will play your computer. That's happening left and right.
Ну, то есть, на самом деле, если мы возьмем вот эти все истории с безответственностью,
If you look at all of those cases of irresponsibility, what kind of consequences he will face if he does not clean up after the dog? What are the natural consequences?
да, скорее всего, будет вонять.
It's gonna stink, right? There will be lots of shit around the house.
Вот. И дальше, в данном случае, учитывая,
And then, if he is not viewing this house as his own, and why? That's another question. He's not viewing this as his home. That's the question of your agreements and negotiations. If he's not viewing this as his own home, then he thinks that the parents are supposed to clean up. But it stinks, I'm gonna close the door in my room and I will tolerate. So, when we talk about these consequences, you have to understand that until you're saying that this is my house, in many cases, he will not understand the consequences. If consequences occur, if he doesn't go to bed on time, it's going to be hard for him to wake up. That's the natural consequence. But if he goes to school every morning, which is really a suffering for him, that would not mean anything yet again. So you have to change the whole paradigm of communication and relationships. You cannot just change one little thing and then he will become good. For this to happen, they have to have a say in the house, and he can have a say in the house if he has the same weight regarding decision making. Or me as a parent, I have to let up a little bit and I just leave him his room, but I'm not gonna look into his room and ask whether something has died in there. This is your room, do whatever. So there has to be a different model of relationships, and before there is such a model, he's not gonna do anything from those chores that we want him to do. And then there is another question. If he is doing something to look good in front of his parents, does this mean responsibility or not? How would you call it? Well, it's kind of an attempt to friendship. Well, I think it's just diligence. So out of all the spheres, the only one that has to do with this child is the fear of becoming a bomb and living under the bridge. So if you are trying to create circumstances where he won't become one. So let's compare responsibility and diligence. What do we need from him? What are we requesting, in fact? And what then we will call responsibility? Just speak up, please. Well, responsibility, he offered himself, but what else? Very well. This is still an issue. I'm trying to do things to look good. Well, being good for other people is natural, but if this is your main motivation to action, that means some kind of neurotic case. Let's come back and see why a responsible child and a parent is important and how it's connected to the bomb under the bridge. So the circumstance that he's seeing behind all this. But what's the key that this responsible person has compared to a diligent person? Well, someone, if he receives praise, he can be diligent as well. And it has nothing to do with the bomb under the bridge. Well, speaking of feelings, I guess that could be mentioned as well. That's available, yes. But that's just one part. Oh, there is another aspect to this. Doing whatever you like to do is not about responsibility. It's not about that. Well, this is about the reasons. Keep digging. Someone said, influence on the others. This is really about the reasons. This is also about the reasons. But how the responsibility is different from diligence. I agree. But stop teasing them. Someone quietly mentioned diligent person also understands the consequences, but on one hand, this is the person who is deciding how to live his life and what kind of restrictions to impose, but the consequences. In that context, we have a responsible person who himself will deal with consequences. The diligent person believes that somebody will deal with the consequences. So when you fear this bomb behind or below the bridge, so that's about the ability to deal with consequences. That's what we are missing, because it's very easy to want something, but then how do you deal with consequences? This is where things become complicated, and this is why it's very important to learn this from childhood. But for this, you need to start from your wishes. And why are we talking about consequences? Well, when we will explain or not explain the consequences of his actions, he's gonna live in this fake reality. He will not understand what's happening or what will happen following this or that action. So you understand that we have a distortion here. You know, it's not really natural. This computer, taking away computer, if he fails his SATs, then there will be no consequences like we talk about. If he fails to go to school, he's not going to live through those circumstances which we tell him about. The consequences will be totally different. And there was this question about long-term consequences. Because, you know, he will have to see something that will take effect after 10 years. Well, you know, sweets as an option. This is where we have this very important nuance. We can try and teach certain things and explain cause and effect, but it can happen only when certain prerequisites apply. This is what's happening. I'm talking about consequences. And I usually use this simple example. When a little boy is not let close to an oven and we are saying no, and we are scolding him. So, you know what's gonna happen, the natural consequence. If he touches the oven, he will get burnt. And that's gonna be natural consequence. Here, we have this very interesting fact. If you explain everything to this child and you tell him that the oven is dangerous, and then he touches it and he's not getting burned, then what's going to happen? He will have mistrust. It depends on the child. It depends on other contexts. But there are two options of ways out. So either mom is lying or mom doesn't know how reality works. Sometimes it's both. But that is a problem. So we are talking about trust. And we want to closely track what we are telling this child. And every time we are giving them all the options so that they could understand that if something happens, they will accept it, because there is a question and there is an answer. If somebody is giving you the entire set of options, well, the probability is low that this will happen, then there is high probability that this will happen. So this child will try for many times, and then he will understand that the universe is a very complex thing. And then at a certain age, he will have trust. From my observations, for teenagers, half a year of hearing these options is enough to start noticing that this universe is complex. For my child, it took between 3 to 6 years. Because between 3 to 6, she was trying to understand how complicated this world is. And now she's coming to me for advice because she now understands that I'm not going to give her a direct answer because all of those options can be realized. So at 6, she now understands the ambiguity of the universe. Before 3, we just live with what we have. You can explain that the situations can be different. I'm not letting you do this something physically right now. It's not because I'm making you not do this every time, but I'm just trying to create space where you cannot get hold of dangerous things. If something is not super dangerous, well, like matches, I'll be around and I'll watch. I'll keep an eye on you. Do you understand the concept? What kind of concept? But the minimum requirements. No, we haven't even touched it. So, natural consequences plus trust. Trust is born from this ambiguity of consequences, where I allow them to try anything with some restrictions where things are very critical. Now, minimal requirements. Why it's important to have less restrictions and less requirements. There are many reasons to this. The less restrictions and requirements we have, the more opportunities to study the reality you have. And then he can look at the natural consequences. This happens as part of the dialogue. We discuss all this. When everything happens, we reflect about this, why it happened. And then this child will draw the links between all these phases. And then there is another reason why we have restrictions. Our mentality has the need in freedom. Our mental state does not accept a lot of restrictions. If those restrictions are objective and natural, and this child doesn't see an alternative option, back in the Soviet times, in principle, there was no alternative to going to school. And in this case, he's not resisting the idea. Now he says, well, there is an option. You may not go to school. So before, the requirement to go to school for many kids, it was not a restriction. Now for many kids, it sounds like a restriction. And in this case, we have to think about taking him or not taking him to school. So these are the things that now the child is realizing that, I could do it differently, but they tell me to do it this way. If there are many options, then they start the riot. And these riots are different. Oftentimes, they try to sabotage your orders and they lie. If they do this, then the system of rules which I bring in is discredited. So if this child understands that he violated this rule, then there were consequences. If some of those seizures take place, I violate this rule and everything is fine, and then it seems like all of those rules which I introduced as an adult, they are on the same level. Then he starts violating even those which are critical. The point is that even if we differentiate these rights and rules, doesn't mean that this child will fall for this. This child, in principle, and adults as well, if we call something a rule and something a law, if it's a custom, altogether it's viewed as a complex, as a set of things. If you violate the rule, then you usually will test the laws as well. I would suggest that it's best not to do this. It's best to leave some critical things in, like drugs, and leave some restrictions regarding that. But everything else should be let go, because if there are so many restrictions, then you discredit the entire system. Then things get violated. You have a feeling like it should be done, right? If there are too many restrictions, it's just impossible to live. You start violating those restrictions. How much time do we have? Would like to draw a mechanism of responsibility. All of those prerequisites are here. Right. We just need to make a structure out of this, and then we will have a solid picture in our head, and we will be able to understand how to use it in life. Where everything begins, what do you think? When does responsibility occur? Emergence of a wish. Who finds it strange? Why do we have to have it here? Very well. What do we need to want, not to be able to want? Safety. Freedom. What do you need to have for those wishes to occur? The needs. What do you need to understand your wishes? Maybe there are some wishes, but you just don't understand. Well, satisfy. How do you figure out that they're there? You need to try and test. Calmness, support, safety. This is very good, but what do you need for this? You need enough time. It's all about time. When there is no proper schedule, daily schedule, where you have clubs and classes and whatnot. So it's about free time. Just let's leave him alone. Let him be and do nothing. Different people view freedom differently. This young man says that everything is good, total freedom, but if he is doing nothing, just sits there, I'm going nuts. But when he sits there and does nothing, that's an important process. For some people, in some situations, they need to sit like this for a couple of months. Well, when I have a wish, what's happening? What? Before I act. Well, I have a wish, a solution. How do I find a solution? Great. I need to have what? I need to have a choice. So, the freedom of choice. Very important. You need to have similar alternatives, or equal alternatives. Not buying or not buying a dog. We have to have equally important or significant alternatives. For him, maybe it could be equal, but it's very personal. So when we talk about the child, it's important for him to want something. That's good, because we have parents of 15-year-olds and they claim their kids want nothing. And we have a discussion later. So, freedom of choice. And they still come to us because he himself will not be able to choose alternatives. It's good, of course, if he can do this himself, but it's not always like this. Sometimes it's about buying or not buying a dog. And it's also about the equality of relationships. We don't have a situation where I kind of love you here, but here you're frustrated. The question about the dog is really a problem. You know, this is my house. I make the decision to have a dog or not to have a dog, because in principle this child is not ready to make that call. So during a class, if you're bothering someone and you can leave, it's a bad alternative, because in this case somebody is sending you away. What about democratic schools? Why they offer this equal alternatives? Because you can just go outside and climb a tree or build a house or do something interesting, or go to a library and read. That is pretty much an equal alternative. I really love the phrase of our teacher, a philosopher from Estonia. He says that when the person himself is making that decision, he himself, when he has freedom of choice, then there is the feeling of responsibility. Not the responsibility, but the feeling of responsibility and the desire to act. So this is based on just feelings. There are some traumas and some fears, but you don't have to inoculate anything to anyone. If this child can make a decision, if he says, I made that decision myself, automatically he will have the feeling of responsibility. Also, you have to factor in natural consequences, right? If there are no natural consequences, then you might not have that feeling of responsibility. Someone said that at 3 years old, he was shocked because now he has to wipe his ass himself, because before those were parents doing this. So now we are taking away that natural consequence, and this is where we might have an interruption. But if we restore those natural consequences, then everything will be restored as well. So he made a decision, he acted, and then what's next? Consequences or results. What's the difference between consequences and results? You can measure a result. Well, you're all correct. Consequences, something you did not expect. Result is something you attained.
You have to look at this from any potential perspective and any angle, indeed. What's the experience then? Analysis, reflecting on the results and analyzing them. how should you properly do this at this stage? If we do it right. Yeah, what was the goal? The outcome, right? Whether it meets our expectations. How well satisfied are we with the outcome? The level of satisfaction, the explanation why we failed, recognizing which factors impacted the outcome, right?
Ну, опять-таки, если мы заведем это понятие фактора, то оно станет понятным.
Что там еще? Вот смотрите, факторы, они как, почему очень часто, мне кажется, что это очень важный момент, когда мы разделяем...
That's very important to break down the factors
которые зависели от меня и зависели не от меня,
that
да? То есть это нормально, когда ребенок может
I could have impacted and which I could not. For instance, you can tell a child, well, it was up to me, but that was beyond my control.
Здесь важный момент, да, как Наташа Побична сказала, что здесь принципиально обстановка полной безопасности.
And here is the atmosphere of full safety and the fact that the kid volunteers to discuss. And I can ask a child, are you ready to discuss it? Or wait for him to be ready. And then I start asking questions based on the structure I keep in mind. Obviously, with time, he can deliver it on his own, but there might be some oppression if parents try to force it. So only the kid should initiate this discussion, and then it might happen so that the kid would share with us things that are important to us. That's how it looks to us. I deeply believe that from the youngest age possible, without forcing a child, suggest that we could discuss something, allowing a kid to reflect on important topics, raising the ability to forecast the consequences of actions, decisions, choices. That's we believe is very important. Thanks a lot. We ran out of time. Thank you.